A rifle is once again the subject of a hotly contested debate in this country. Many of the deadliest mass shootings in America have seen from the use of this gun, from the Vegas massacre, 60 lives lost there, to what we just witnessed in Texas, where 3 young children and 5 adults, all under 35, were lost. We want to look deeper at the popularity of the AR-15 with Timothy Lytton. He's a law professor at Georgia State University and also author of the book, Suing the Gun Industry, a battle at the crossroads of gun control and mass torts. Professor, thanks for giving us some time this morning. We appreciate it.
Good morning.
Washington Post, as I'm sure you know, just did an extensive look at the AR-15 from all angles, and it is fascinating. And I want folks to understand it is now the best-selling rifle in America. 1 in 20 Americans own one. That's roughly 16 million of us own one. Can you talk a little bit about why they've become so popular, even in the face of all these mass shootings? It's become quite a symbol in this country's struggle with gun violence. How and why?
I think there are 2 things that account for the popularity of the AR-15 platform type weapons. The first of which is really marketing. The firearms industry, after the ceasing of the end of the assault weapons ban in 2004, really started to push the AR-15 as a weapon that would provide a tactical experience for firearms owners. And that tactical experience is something that I think there was a market for. There was both a taste for this in American gun culture, and there was also a marketing strategy behind it, and these 2 things sort of fed on each other. I think the second reason for the popularity of the weapon is it's become a powerful political symbol for not just firearms rights, but really a whole host of items on the conservative political agenda. And you see this in lawn signs, for example, in congressional races in North Georgia, where I live. Instead of American flags or the Statue of Liberty or some other symbol of liberty, the symbol of liberty has become an AR-15 platform weapon. There are silhouettes of these weapons that are used to suggest what the alignment of a political candidate is. So I think that the weapon itself, besides just its popularity, has become a very powerful symbol. And in some ways, it's caught in a kind of cycle. The more the weapon shows up in mass shootings, the more calls there are to ban it. And the more calls there are to ban it, the more people are intent on going out and buying the weapon. And the more people go out and buy the weapon, the harder it is to regulate the weapon, which makes it more likely to show up in these sorts of criminal shootings. So there's a kind of vicious cycle that's been going on around the AR-15.
Wow, and your mention of the marketing strategy is really fascinating, because that's a huge part of this. But the fact that it's also being used as a symbol of liberty in some corners of the country is very, very telling. Back to that Washington Post reporting, I want you to break some of this down. The survey found that AR-15 owners come from red, blue, and purple states. Compared to Americans as a whole, AR-15 owners are significantly more likely to be white, male, and between the ages of 40 and 65. They're also more likely to have higher incomes, to have served in the military, and to be Republican. AR-15 owners are more likely to live in states former President Trump won in 2020 than adults overall. Can you help us understand the demographics of AR-15 ownership in the country as well? Or does it go back to that marketing and politics?
Sure, I think it's dangerous to overgeneralize, but I think some of the indicators that you just mentioned, people who live in states that were won by Trump in the previous election, suggest that the AR-15 as a symbol of liberty is really stronger in places that have more Republican leanings at this point. And, you know, keep in mind, the symbol is in part realized by people's ability to go out and purchase and own the weapon. So the fact is, people don't just want the weapon to be legal, people want to purchase and own the weapon as a way to really affirm their rights. For a lot of people, the Second Amendment is as or more important than the First Amendment. And many people who want to exercise their First Amendment rights don't just cherish them, they want to go out and practice them. They go out and demonstrate, they write letters to the editors, they celebrate a free press. They're really engaged actively with the First Amendment, and First Amendment rights is really a cornerstone of liberty. I think a lot of people who see firearms ownership as an important expression of the Second Amendment are really engaged in purchasing these weapons to affirm that commitment to the Second Amendment is really a pillar of American liberty.
It's an affirmation that's so fascinating. On a much lesser degree, it almost reminds me of the battle we had, and maybe are still having to a lesser extent, over vaccines and masks. If you had, at a certain point in this pandemic, if you had a mask on or were saying, hey, I'm going to get the shot, I'm going to get the booster, that was seen as indicative of your politics. And folks who rejected that also used the same argument. You can't tell me what to do with my body and cover my nose and my mouth. It is this sense of liberty, what the government can tell me I can and cannot do, which is fascinating. Another stat here, 10 of the 17 deadliest U.S. mass shootings since 2012 have involved AR-15. One Republican lawmaker, Barry Moore of Alabama, introduced a bill in February to declare the AR-15, quote, the national gun of America. About your point about what a symbol it's become. We want a national gun in America as we deal with the ravages of a gun violence epidemic seemingly every week, if not every day. For folks who look at this from a legal perspective, beyond the Second Amendment, you're also an expert on what it takes in terms of legal action in the gun industry in this country. Where does that stand right now? Is that a push that has gained or lost steam and been more successful or not?
Many victims and their families after these mass shootings file lawsuits against not only the shooter, but against the manufacturers of the weapons that are used in the massacres. In this case, very often manufacturers of AR platform weapons. And those lawsuits claim that the firearms manufacturers have some responsibility for the mass shootings. And the reason is for a number of theories. One is that the design of these weapons makes them especially lethal. The bullet wounds from an AR-15 weapon are much greater than you would have, for example, from a handgun. The second is the marketing practices of these companies. Companies are pushing not only the tactical experience, but they're placing these products in video games, giving people an opportunity to play out scenarios that look, sadly like what we see in mass shootings. And the third is distribution practices. Many companies are supplying large volumes of weapons to places where they know the legal market probably won't be able to absorb all those weapons. And so there's some sense that the firearms industry may be aware of how these weapons are trafficked. These lawsuits generally have not succeeded because the federal government in 2005 passed a law immunizing the firearms industry from civil lawsuits that arise out of criminal misuse of a weapon. There are some exceptions to that immunity shield, and current litigation now is sort of testing the boundaries of those exceptions. So we're seeing lawsuits out of Uvalde or after Highland Park or after the Buffalo shooting that are based on these theories against the firearms manufacturers, seeking to hold the firearms manufacturing industry liable and responsible for mass shootings, somewhat like we hold the pharma industry liable for the opioid epidemic. It's not their sole responsibility, but many people think that the industry plays a role here and should be held to account. The difference between the pharma industry in the opioid scenario and the firearms industry, of course, is the federal immunity shield, and that's the subject of litigation around the country currently.
At this point, are those companies, though, or those gun makers, and most gun makers now have their own version of the AR-15. That's how popular they are. They all have jumped in that game and made an AR-15-esque weapon to have in their lineup because of the soaring popularity of it. I would assume they're wealthy enough to withstand, either well-lawyered enough or well-moneyed enough to withstand whatever legal challenges may come. No one wants to write a big check, but they sell a lot of guns in this country financially. We're talking about I assume, very lucrative companies.
Well, on the one hand, the firearms industry and its trade association, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, have spent a lot of money defending these lawsuits for the last 25 years. They've been largely successful. Their legal bills are considerable, but they're, as you mentioned, they're bills that could be handled by a major industry. On the other hand, I don't think one should underestimate the power of the message that liability sends. The pharma industry is by orders of magnitude much larger than the firearms industry. And the pharma industry has really been brought to its knees, paying out tens of billions of dollars in settlements and refashioning the way they do business around opioids. They've redesigned opioid products, they've changed their marketing of opioid products, and they've changed their distribution. And they've done that because the judgments that have been brought against them have sent a very powerful message. And that's basically the idea behind the lawsuits, that somebody needs to send a powerful message to the industry to do what it is within their power to try and at least control their marketing efforts and the supply chain. Now, that being said, we don't have clear proof that the firearms industry could have that kind of influence that we've seen, for example, that the pharma industry has had. but we won't know until they actually try. And they don't currently really have much incentive to try and do things that might reduce the risk of criminal misuse or criminal diversion of their weapons. And the best incentive for that right now is probably litigation. It doesn't look like Congress is in a particularly good position to pass firearms legislation. Congress is as divided as ever, and we're coming up on an election year. I wouldn't expect to see major gun legislation at a federal level this year in an election year.
And real quick, to end on a political note as well, much like abortion, there is a national consensus on guns in this country. Most people do support common sense gun control, particularly background checks, things of that nature. What's striking to me always is the disconnect between what the American people in polls say that they want and then what D.C. is unable to get done. On the issue of guns in particular, why is there a gap between what most of the country says, yeah, we support that, and what the folks in D.C. can get done? It is a representative democracy at the end of the day. Why can't we get there on this issue from your perspective?
It's much easier in the American political system to block legislation than it is to pass legislation. You only need a handful of votes in a place like the Senate in order to kill legislation or to kill it in a committee in the House. And that's, in fact, by design. The founders of the United States built a constitution that's designed to make sure to block more legislation than it allows, because there was a greater